knowledge has never really been a disinterested entity. In fact, the very assumption that knowledge is something that can be 100% objective or disinterested or value neutral is in itself a very value laden statement. It is a statement that's full of biases and judgments in the first place. Knowledge is very much prone and vulnerable to biases, especially in the field of social sciences and humanities, since it's a kind of field where the production of knowledge is, something which is very open-ended and sort of open to subjective interpretations and biases. Therefore, social sciences and humanities have immense scope for biases and value judgments, especially in the Indian context. Disciplines within humanities and social sciences have been unfortunately used as vehicles of anti Hindu and anti India propaganda. And in the name of scholarship, all sorts of lies and half truths are peddled against the history, culture, civilization, ancient heritage of India, and all sorts of lies are peddled vis-a-vis Hindu dharma. Now, unfortunately, all these so-called scholars who are actually Hindu phobes, Hindu-phobic people masquerading as scholars, they've got so much of media attention and they've become such big, larger-than-life names in their own right that even if anybody questions them with facts, if anybody sort of tries to logically counter their arguments, then you're branded as a propagandist simply because you are contesting the point of view of these particular scholars, and you have no right to contest their point of view. Their point of view is the truth. Such is the level of legitimacy that the point of view of certain scholars has assumed when it comes to discourse on India and discourse on Hinduism. That's why a book like 10 Heads of Ravana, a critique of Hindu-phobic scholars edited by Rajiv Malhotra and Divya Reddy, is a much needed work because it exposes many of these Hindu-phobic scholars, and it kind of lays bare their so-called scholarship, which is actually Hindu-phobia and anti-Hindu hatred masquerading as scholarship. And the unique thing about this book is that this book does in academic style, complete with facts and references. So 10 Heads of Ravana has 10 chapters. It's a collection of 10 essays. Each essay has been written by a separate scholar, and each essay is dedicated to busting the propaganda of a particular Hindu-phobic scholar. And you would see direct quotes from the original works of these so-called scholars, which blatantly, point out how biased they are and how subjective they are in their anti-Hindu opinions and biases. And also, the main crux of their ideas, their main argument, whatever their main theoretical postulations are sort of like you're introduced to those in each chapter, and then the essayist critiques and counters those arguments, those theoretical propositions of these scholars, their arguments one by one by citing from other sources to kind of counter their arguments. So this is more or less the structure of the book. So 10 scholars have been taken in this book in all, which comes to 10 essays. And the scholars taken up in this book are Romila Thapar, Sheldon Pollock, Michael Witzel, Devdutt Patnaik, Irfan Habib, Shashi Tharoor, Audrey Trushke, Ramachandra Guha, Kancha Ilaiya, and Wendy Doniger. So I think it's a special book, guys, because it's the first of its kind that takes the challenge of exposing Hindu-phobic scholars on such a massive scale, and that too in this, academic style kind of book, which is academically written, that brings together so much of rigorous research from multiple sources, from multiple perspectives. And if you're reading this book, no matter what ideological orientation you come from, whether you call yourself a left wing or a right wing, or if you're not interested in politics at all, you would definitely gain something after reading this book. And this book, I can assure you guys, if you read it with an unbiased and a non-colored mindset, then it would certainly be an eye-opener, because you see a lot of stuff that we as Indians are exposed to, be it through the mainstream media, like the television or newspapers or the internet or through social media for that matter. A lot of stuff, a lot of basic ideas about Hinduism, Hindu dharma, Hindu culture, Indian civilization, ancient heritage, history, a lot of these ideas which we are exposed to via mainstream media and popular culture. This book debunks a lot of those theoretical postulations, and we would realize that a lot of these ideas that we have been taken for granted as the truth are actually very biased and they're actually one-sided propaganda, and this book completely busts that one-sided propaganda. So in that sense, this book is a complete eye-opener. But like I said, you have to read this book from a non-prejudiced mindset. No matter what your thinking patterns are, what your ideological orientations are, but if you try and read this book with a kind of non-prejudiced mindset and try and not judge the authors for their ideological orientations or whatever, but simply go by the factual evidence that's provided in this book can certainly be an eye-opener for you. Now, talking about all the Hindu-phobic scholars that have been, whose ideas have been rebutted in this book would take a long time, and we don't have, that kind of time or scope in this video. So what I would really do is that take a few central ideas, a few key ideas that are in fact common to most of the Hindu-phobic scholars that have been exposed in this book, and briefly talk about those ideas one by one. So, one central theme found in the works of most of these Hindu-phobic scholars is the idea of the whitewashing of the Islamic invasion of Bharat. So, you see a lot of these historians and scholars basically try to whitewash the anti-Hindu hatred of the Islamic invaders of Bharat, be it the Mughal invaders, the Mughal rulers of India, or various other kinds of Islamic invaders that preceded that. So this is a common trope that's found in the work of many Hindu-phobic scholars, and not only do they try to whitewash, but they also try to glorify, these Islamic invaders by cooking up all sorts of, by cooking up all sorts of arbitrary facts which never really existed, and basically trying to glorify these people who actually looted India and destroyed Hindu temples. Now, two key prominent Hindu-phobic scholars, as the book explains, who do this consistently are Romila Thapar, the very famous leftist historian Romila Thapar, and Audrey Truschke. Now, Audrey Truschke is somebody, if you have read even a bit of Audrey Truschke, you would know that, or if you just Google her name, you would see that her entire scholarship is based on whitewashing the sins of the Mughal rulers, and especially her work is devoted to glorifying Aurangzeb, and she gives you really irrational arguments. Like, for example, for the whole thing about Aurangzeb destroying Hindu temples, she says that he saved more Hindu temples than he destroyed, and her logic essentially is because by virtue of not destroying the ones he did not destroy, he actually saved a lot of Hindu temples. So such is a lame logic of these Hindu-phobic scholars. And to get into the crux of these debates, into the details of these arguments, you would have to read 10 Heads of Ravana. Then another common thread found in the works of these scholars is the Aryan migration theory, that basically, and you must have heard this a number of times. Like I said, a lot of these ideas are already in the mainstream popular discourse. Even if you're not reading any academic texts, you have been exposed to these ideas. So the Aryan migration theory roughly says that India was invaded by the Aryans who came from outside, and India basically has no insiders, but everybody literally came from outside. So the white-skinned Aryans came to India, and conquered the dark-skinned Dravidians, who, according to this theory, are essentially the natives, the South Indians, and it's these white-skinned Aryans who, sort of established this supremacy over India in the form of its religion, its culture. So according to this conspiracy theory, the entire Sanatan Dharma, what is known as Hindu Dharma or Sanatan Dharma, is in fact an offshoot of the exploitative framework of the white-skinned Aryans who conquered Indians, and it is their way of spreading Brahminical hegemony and conquering the dark-skinned races known as the Dravidians. So this whole Aryan-Dravidian theory, North versus South, is something that's rooted in this Aryan migration theory, and this theory has been developed by was developed by so many European scholars when India was colonized. It was subsequently developed, and this theory was distorted and used by missionaries to aid large-scale conversions in the south part of India. So this is the backdrop of this theory. Now this theory has been discredited, and it's been proved a conspiracy theory, and it's been completely discredited discredited by so many sources and so much of factual evidence. But still, this book argues that still these Hindu-phobic scholars, most of the scholars mentioned in this book, continue to take recourse to the Aryan migration theory and continue to selectively, quote from certain sources, but they do not quote the literature which discredits this theory. So they kind of, are biased, are promoting this Aryan migration theory to divide India in a very biased and, sort of a distorted way. Next, the book delves deep into the anti-Hindu propaganda of scholars like Shashi Tharoor and Devdutt Patnaik, who claim to be propagating the cause of Hinduism. Now, this is Shashi Tharoor and Devdutt Patnaik, especially disturbing figures because, on one hand of the spectrum, you have scholars like Audrey Truschke who are outrightly, and Romila Thapar, who are outrightly spitting venom against Hinduism and, distorting the history of India very outrightly. So these kind of people you can still deal with, and also because they are purely academic, so their reach to the general sort of Indian population is somewhat limited. But when it comes to people like Shashi Tharoor and Devdutt Patnaik, the kind of books they write, actually it comes into the category of general interest non-fiction books. So they're pretty dangerous because their books are taken as an authority on Hinduism by many lay educated Hindus. So if you go on Amazon and type their names and look at the books that have been published by them, you would actually, if you do not know about any of these biases or the kind of theoretical postulations of their work, then you would actually assume that they're talking well about Hinduism and they're kind of some kind of authority on Hinduism. Shashi Tharoor has written a lot of books on Hinduism, and so it's the same with Devdutt Patnaik. But this book argues that both of them in fact distort Hinduism, and in the process of distorting Hinduism, they're carrying a very dangerous propaganda because, like I said, a lot of people take them to be a lot of English-speaking Indians who cannot go back to the original sources, who cannot, go back to the Vedas, Upanishads, and the Ramayana and Mahabharata. They take these kind of people to be the writers, to be the authority on Hindu Dharma and civilization. So the essay on Shashi Tharoor tells us how Tharoor misrepresents Hindu Dharma by using its pluralistic ethos as a weapon against Hinduism itself. He uses the Hinduism is tolerant trope to whitewash everything from the Mughal rule to the British rule to the forced conversion of Hindus. So Tharoor is the secular all Hindus should be wary of. Now, Tharoor also propagates the common stereotype, and this is another trope that you will see in all these Hindu-phobic scholars. They all have this idea, they seem to propagate this idea that, because India is this kind of melting pot of cultures, the Aryans came from outsiders, the British came from outsiders, everybody in India basically came from outsiders, the Mughals came from outsiders, so we have this beautiful syncretic culture. So India doesn't have any original native culture of its own. So the whole idea of a nation state in the context of India is a farce. So we don't have to think about India in terms of a nation state, thus challenging, the ideas of nationalism and patriotism, which is a very, very dangerous and anti-India trope. Because if you look in the context of, the history of all civilizations, or the way all civilizations portray the histories, be it the European civilization or the Chinese civilizations or the ancient Greek and Egyptian civilizations, they all portray their history in terms of, unification. They all try to portray a unified perspective, a glorious perspective of their history, and, which is something which is not critically contested. But in the case of India, the only a widespread common perception of history we have is this distorted perspective that India doesn't have any history at all and that everybody essentially came from outside. So India doesn't have any unified history of original native identity. It's kind of its own indigenous identity, indigenous pride, nationalism. So this is a very, very disturbing trope. And that's why somebody like Shashi Tharoor is very, very dangerous, because he tries to, completely distort a lot of these ideas while just trying to, sound progressive. Devdutt Patnaik, another highly popular author amongst educated Bharatiyas, now he appropriates and misinterprets Ved, Puran, Ramayana, Mahabharata and Hindu epics to create his own fancy and frivolous theories on management, etc. Now Devdutt Patnaik, there's a lot of material, available on YouTube. In fact, Rajiv Malhotra's Infinity Foundation has done a lot of research on this regard, and you can see a lot of videos which kind of expose the distortion of Devdutt Patnaik. Now, the problem with Devdutt Patnaik is that he is again read by a huge number of Indians, and he calls his works non-fiction, but they are actually not non-fiction. He makes up a lot of stuff, so he distorts a lot of facts, from the Ved, Purana, and Upanishads, and he tries to give his own colored perspective and judgment to these facts, completely distorts these facts to maybe just add a little bit of drama and intrigue to his stories, or maybe he's trying to sell a particular viewpoint or a narrative. Now, it's very, very disturbing because had he called his work, mythological fiction or something, it would have been still acceptable, but he calls it non-fiction. So a lot of English-speaking Indians take him as the authority on ancient Hindu texts. So Devdutt Patnaik, the book, argues, and if you read the essay in detail, you would come to know that how dangerous Devdutt Patnaik's work is in relation to Hinduism and India. Then Ten Heads of Ravana sheds light on the vicious propaganda of well-known Sanskrit scholars like Sheldon Pollock and Michael Witzel, who spit venom against Hindu civilization, dharma, and culture in the name of studying Sanskrit. According to these scholars, a language like Sanskrit is embedded in deep-seated power structures, and its study is linked to the spread of Brahminical hegemony. Now, it's amazing, that in context of all other civilizations or the study of all other cultures and languages, be it Islamic civilizations, or be it, the study of Christianity, a lot of sources, predominant number of sources, or let's to put it simply, predominant number of people who are known for the study of these disciplines come with an insider's perspective. That is, if you're talking about Islamic studies or studies related to Islamic civilizations, and priority will be given to those voices, who have practiced that culture, who have lived in that civilization, who have an insider's authority. Same goes with Christianity. Not that critical perspectives are not allowed, but critical perspectives always come later. But I think Hinduism is perhaps the only religion where, a critical perspective is not even allowed. Whatever studies you have, related to Hinduism, the scholars who are considered the top-notch scholars in the field of Indic studies or the study of Sanskrit and Hinduism are, paradoxically enough, they are the ones who actually have an anti-Hindu and an anti-Sanskrit perspective. So where is the insider's perspective? If insider's perspective is, if all other studies are characterized by an insider's perspective, then how is it that in Hinduism an insider's perspective is not even allowed? So the book, in its, criticism of the Sanskrit studies, the way Sanskrit studies are conducted, and the way, people who are leading the chairs of Sanskrit studies in these, very fancy departments of huge universities like Harvard University, they are thought to be authorities in Sanskrit, whereas the real acharyas of India who have actually studied Sanskrit, and lived that dharmic lifestyle, their teachings are completely discredited and mocked. The book really highlights that dichotomy and problem. So finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that what you get out of this book, 10 Heads of Ravana, a critique of Hindu-phobic scholars, is totally up to your existing knowledge base, what you already know about these issues. But irrespective of your knowledge base, I think this book is a must read for every educated Indian, no matter what your age group is. The best thing about this book is that it gives you a very detailed and critical insight into the whole anti-India, anti-Hinduism, woke propaganda machinery. You get to learn about all the linkages, permutations, and combinations of this machinery, the way this machinery works through the academic institutions, and then these issues which start at the level of academia, the way they get percolated down to the lowest common denominator in television debates and in newspapers. So it's interesting to see the linkages. You'll be able to better appreciate the linkages between the world of academia and the way these issues then come up in mainstream public debate and how they influence the media narrative, because most of us do not make these connections, right? When we see something, for example, when we see the way the newspapers or the way the TV debates talk about minorities in India, or way the international media, for example, talk about minorities in India, the supposed mistreatment of minorities in India, or the way international media talks about or interprets the Ram Mandir issue of India, we do not realize that a lot of these value judgments which the international media uses in its copy, in its language, we do not realize that a lot of these value judgments are actually coming from the world of academia. So it's these Hindu-phobic scholars who are giving the raw material for these value judgments, which are becoming a part of the mainstream media discourse. And this is a very important point. And I think it's the most kind of. It's something which we all miss, and this is precisely why you should read a book like 10 Heads of Ravan, because apart from the facts and the kind of specific stuff mentioned in this book gives you the right tools to critically analyze the mediascape around you, to critically analyze the way Hindu issues are talked about in the media, the way issues related to Hindus, the way issues related to India are misinterpreted on the international stage and in Indian woke media. So, guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the content, please do press the like button and please do subscribe to the channel. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.